sisters and brothers.
Good evening.
Welcome to Detroit Branch of Workers' World Party's commemoration and celebration of Black History Month. Although we should be celebrating Black history all the time, right? Not just in February. So, but you know, it's well, that's the way it is now. It won't always be that way. I want to go before I have call up our speakers for tonight, our featured speaker tonight. By the way, where is Tasha? Oh, okay. So it's just you?
Yep.
Okay. So before we get to our featured speaker tonight, who will be talking about giving a revolutionary perspective on the Emancipation Proclamation, I have a few announcements that I will give, and then we will have Abayomi come up to the podium for our featured talk tonight. And it's very exciting because there's always a view of history that we as a Revolutionary Party need to give to working and oppressed people. And it's always different from that, the propaganda and the garbage that we hear day in and day out. So I'm excited to hear this. I do want to apologize for being late today. As always, no matter when I start, it never ends well.
No, it ends well.
But, I'm sorry, because I just knew I was going to be here at 5 o'clock. Well, no. So my apologies for having people wait for dinner. Our first announcement tonight is that the moratorium and the Cowie, moratorium now and the Cowie meetings regularly scheduled for Monday nights here at 7 o'clock. This upcoming Monday will feature Jorge Parra, who recently ended a 75-day hunger strike protesting GM's firing of injured workers in Colombia. The significance of this, of course, is that Mr. Parra, who had worked for General Motors in Colombia, and many of his co-workers have suffered various injuries. Well, they can't do it here, but overseas,
yes, they can.
they can, well, just let me finish. Overseas, they can simply dump the workers. Now, no, they're not able to dump the workers here in this country, but that's precisely why they do it in Colombia and other countries where the big three is, has factories and so on and so forth. So he sustains an on-the-job injury. He gets no workers' compensation, nothing, and then is summarily fired from his job. Well, you know what? Workers in this country are absolutely connected to workers around the world. And don't forget, it wasn't that long ago that this is exactly what happened to the workers here. And the only thing that made a difference was the years of trade union struggles and fights and sit-ins, etc., that finally won some rights for workers. So things change, but when you look at it nowadays, I think things are changing now. Yeah. Because they have tiered salaries now. They have, it's a constant, well, geez, can you take a concession here or take a concession there, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have to do is open our eyes to not only what happens here in Detroit or in Michigan, but really what happens around the world. Because the profits that General Motors is making are off the backs of all the workers around the world. And so we really should stand in solidarity with those workers and support the activities. So I will remind you that at 7 o'clock on Monday, this upcoming Monday, Jorge Parra will be here to talk about the problems that the workers in Colombia are experiencing with General Motors. So I hope that you will turn out for that. A week from today, Saturday, March the 2nd, at 5 p.m., we will begin the first of 4 classes on what is Zionism. These are exceptionally interesting classes that I would encourage people to come to hear, because all we see today is how Israel has the right to bomb Gaza and, starve the Palestinians in Palestine in their homeland, etc. We don't get the history of what truly is happening there. But this is an opportunity really to look at Zionism as it evolves and the purposes that it serves. So I would really encourage you, if you have any questions or concerns or want to know, these classes will be ideal to come out to and participate in and learn from. The compilation of material is incredibly interesting and eye-opening. And believe me, there will be things that you'll hear that you will not believe. And it's worth it to hear that, because this is the true history of Zionism and the role that it has played in the Middle East. So I welcome you, I invite you to come out to the classes. The following Saturday, on March the 9th, will be the commemoration of International Women's Day. On the table, we've passed out leaflets talking about the International Women's Day. It's a very exciting program that we have featured, planned, and I won't have to cook. The brothers will be cooking. So come on now. Not only do we want you to come out and support us women and stand in solidarity with women around the world, but hey, I want you to try their food. It'll be good. Because like all food that's prepared for these meetings, it's prepared in love and commitment and, to satisfy people. Now, I wasn't happy with all the food I prepared. I am very critical of my work, but next time, I will do better.
It's delicious.
Then I want to call people's attention to a foreclosure activity that we're working on now. It's the Baxter Jones foreclosure. And what would ask is that people go to moratorium-mi.org to find out a list of contacts that we can call, the banks, Fannie and Freddie or whatever, these calls do have an effect. They might even have disconnected the lines or whatever. Nonetheless, it would be very helpful if we could just get these calls out on the Baxter Jones foreclosure and just inundate them with calls. And finally, I would like to let people know that this past week, or actually last week, we lost a comrade and friend and supporter of Detroit Workers' World Party, and a person that all of you, I'm sure, will remember, Azikiwe. He had funeral services were this past Friday, it's sad to have to say goodbye to a man who was a leader, who wanted to educate and politicize the youth, the black youth and youth of any kind. Actually, he was clear on that. But unfortunately, he is gone. He's passed on, and I just want people to know that it's we lose. Well, it's always hard to lose anyone, but we had to say goodbye to Tashi. And I will also say that Tashi had a tremendous personal library, and he donated that library to us, to the Detroit branch of the Good Heart. And in addition, another comrade who has long passed away, Comrade Ted Dostal in Cleveland, is also contributing some very fine books and reading material to the Detroit branch library. So over the next year, we will be working on creating a lending library that will be composed of all of these wonderful resources that will be contributed to the office. So I would tell people that when the opportunity comes and we have the library eventually set up, make sure you take some time to browse through and look to see what is there. I know that you will find something that you will enjoy reading and will be beneficial to you. So the development of the library, the Tashi, Kia, and Ted Dostal, library we'll be working on that in the upcoming months, and I welcome all of you back to take a look at that library and see if there's something that you wouldn't want to read. I know that there will be. So yes.
Let's make a couple. Is it okay? Just so people, this S. Baxter Jones case. One of the reasons we took it on is following up the rally we had that targeted the Fannie Mae role, which is the federal government role in foreclosures and evictions. This individual came to us, and this is a man who's taught for over 20 years in the public schools. He was in an auto accident, suffered a brain injury, actually went back to work and taught for a couple of years afterwards, but is severely disabled right now. And he's facing, when he came to us, he was facing an eviction this Monday in Jackson by Fannie Mae, by the federal government, as a disabled person. And they actually wrote the servicer saying that, he was in the process of trying to get disability, ran out of, he went through a period of time where he had nothing coming in, and that, that he asked for a forbearance while he was fighting to get Social Security disability, which he's gotten. And he's fighting for a pension now, which he probably will get at some point. But instead of working with him, the government's ready to toss him out. And so we've taken up the case. We believe we got at least a short respite on the eviction by encouraging to file for bankruptcy, which he did with the help of someone who works with us. And but there is a subcommittee. It was brought up of the Detroit Eviction Committee that we're part of, to build like a rally in Jackson to build support for more public support. And if anyone's interested in working on it, we had a number of volunteers. They should probably see David, if that's okay, because there'll be a meeting soon to kind of plan this rally and as well as what Debbie said, to look for the emails. And these calls to Wells Fargo and Fannie Mae, they make a difference. And we want to put it's a disgusting case, like they all are, but it's really graphically, and it kind of continues to work on connecting exposing the role of the government in foreclosing and evicting disabled people. I mean, from the Jerome Jackson, it's just unbelievable. Just a couple other things on the foreclosure front. The next Saturday, there's a kind of a legal clinic and organizing clinic at 11 a.m. at Central Methodist Church for anyone who is interested or spread the word. To educate people more on the fight, and also we are taking up at the last eviction committee. based on really proposals that were initiated by Mike and Abayomi from our organization, a fight around the tax foreclosures. And right now, the federal government has hundreds of millions of dollars available to pay people's back property tax bills. It's sitting there. But of course, rather than release it, they're moving forward with evicting people and foreclosing on people. And we're talking about 40,000. In the meantime, the banks who don't pay any, 48% of the banks who foreclose on properties don't pay property taxes. They sell their properties to these scum investors who don't pay the property taxes and lure people into their homes and then toss them out. Instead of going after them, so what we raised to the treasurer, who actually came to the eviction meeting, his representative, is put a moratorium on tax foreclosures for occupied homes while people are fighting to get these funds. Because the other thing is the funds, the fact that there's such a delinquency in tax foreclosures that it costs the city $80 million a year. So if you kept people in their homes and got these federal dollars released, you'd save the city tens of millions of dollars. But of course, God forbid that they think about that any of this thinking goes on in the capitalist world we live in. So anyway, we're going to be planning actions around that as well. And this Detroit, so I would encourage people to come to the moratorium meeting on Monday. There's a lot. And the other issue that's come to the fore, of course, is the emergency manager. And we have a lawsuit now. The city has 21 days to respond. They've not responded to demand the release of all the city bond deals. Because and of course, if you read all the articles in the paper about the emergency man, not one of them, one article has mentioned the the hundreds of millions of dollars in debt service that the city pays to the bank. And in fact, the reason the city's broke is not because it doesn't take in enough revenue to pay for the services. It's because so much of the revenue is being diverted to the same banks who destroyed our neighborhoods with foreclosures. And not one, you'd think they'd publish a financial review team report. Nothing was mentioned in it. What a joke. And that's where the money is. And we're getting those papers so we can really expose it. It's just, I was doing more research today, and it's just grotesque. I mean, the city gets in all these interest rate swaps. They were fraudulent swaps from the banks because the banks knew that, I won't we'll talk more, but it's just disgusting. Well, excuse me. But it's very important. So these are all activities that are coming up. So there's a lot going on in terms of intervening in the struggle of the intensifying oppression against just killing our class here. That there's a lot of work to do. So if people want to help with the Jones case, see David, and also I really would encourage people to come to the Monday night meetings. There's a lot going on right now, and not enough is going on either compared to what needs to happen.
Okay, so if there are no other announcements from the floor, I would like now to welcome to the podium Brother Abayomi Azikiwe, who will be talking about a revolutionary perspective on the Emancipation Proclamation. We ain't free.
Okay, thank you so much for coming out in this horrible weather here in the state of Michigan. We try to get used to it, but it just doesn't happen. I want to first of all thank Comrade Debbie for the wonderful African American History Month dinner and that beautiful cake over there. Always a pleasure. People who attend our meetings know that we have the best food in the movement. Not only the best politics, but the best food as well. I also want to mention, before I start my presentation this evening, Workers' World newspaper, which comes out every week, is published in New York City, and we distribute it here out of this office in the city of Detroit, published a series of 4 articles this month on African American History Month. And on February the 7th, which was the first article, and I wrote these articles, but that's not why I'm plugging them. Because if you read the paper, there's so many other good articles every week. And Comrade Chris Hamill is one of the managing editors, and David writes also for the paper. Jerry writes for the paper. Ray writes for the paper. Mike writes for the paper. Tom writes for the paper. And we're open, for people to write. The first article, February the 7th, dealt with the centenary of Mrs. Rosa Parks, who was a Detroiter, even though she was born in Tuskegee, Alabama, and became known for the Montgomery bus boycott. She settled here in Detroit in 1957 and worked for John Conyers after 1965 when he got in Congress. And of course, the old 12th Street is named after her as Rosa Parks Boulevard, where the rebellion started in 1967. The second article dealt with the legacy of Claudia Jones, African Caribbean Marxists and communists who made a tremendous contribution to the struggle, anti-capitalist struggle here in this country between the 1930s and the 1950s, when she was deported from the United States during the Cold War and McCarthy era. Under the Smith Act, she was convicted and deported to Britain in 1955, and after she went there, she largely initiated the black movement in Britain, established the Carnival, the West Indian Gazette newspaper, and she died in 1964 in England. And that was the second article. The third article, which came out in the February 21st issue, deals with the legacy of Dr. W.B. Du Bois and his second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois, today is his 145th birthday. He was born on February 23rd of 1868. He died on August 28th of 1963, which was the day that the March on Washington took place, which was 50 years ago this year, and we just commemorated the kickoff to this, silver, I guess in a way, 50th anniversary of the March on Detroit, which Dr. King delivered his first I Have a Dream speech here in the city of Detroit at Cobo Hall. And it was like 250, 300,000 people who showed up for that march on June 23rd of 1963. And because of the success of that march, they knew that they could organize a march on Washington, which took place 2 months later. And the final article, which is in the latest issue of Workers' Room, all these papers over here on the table, so before you leave today, pick them up. This deals with the 1963 mass struggles, advanced civil rights. Of course, 50 years ago, as I mentioned before, since 1963, and that was a watershed year for struggle. Now, today's topic deals with the 150th anniversary of the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued by President Abraham Lincoln. It was initially drafted in 1862. It was, I believe it was in September of 1862 when the final draft was completed, and then it went into effect on January the 1st of 1863, 150 years ago. And this year, we've seen a number of programs, even here in the city of Detroit, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which we're reading early last month at the Detroit Historical Museum, and they read the Emancipation Proclamation. They had a reenactment, what they said could have been possibly how the enslaved Africans responded to the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. They also had a reenactment of some African-American troops, the colored regiments that I'll be talking about a little bit later in my presentation, who were drafted into the, well, actually initially as volunteers, but they were enlisted in the Union Army, and it was a whole struggle around that, actually beginning in 1861, 1862, and eventually in 1863, almost 200,000 African, those who were enslaved, those who were considered free, those who had ran away from slavery, actually enlisted in the Union Army, and actually played a critical role in the outcome of the Civil War. Now, 2013 is a year of commemorations, as we just talked about during the first 5 minutes of this presentation. I mentioned that today, February 23rd, is the 145th anniversary of the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a leading figure in the struggle for African emancipation, beginning in the late 19th century and extending to 1963, some 50 years ago, when he passed away in the West African state of Ghana, which at that time was the fountainhead of the worldwide black movement, headed by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who in fact went to school here in the United States at Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania, and had close ties with the African American community. Du Bois, whose work we will utilize in today's presentation on the Civil War and Reconstruction, pioneered the social, scientific, and historical study of African life in the United States as well as on the continent. Prior to his existence as a scholar and activist, there was very little serious social, scientific, or historical work around African Americans and also Africa. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Of course, today, this program is being held to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January the 1st of 1863. Since the beginning of this year, there have been much discussion on this anniversary. But today we hope to provide an alternative viewpoint on the historical, political, economic, and social forces that led to the demise of the slave system in the United States, the eruption of the Civil War, and the failed attempt to reconstruct democracy in the United States. In other words, these things didn't happen spontaneously, and they were not based upon subjective factors of individuals, for example, President Abraham Lincoln. And of course, many people may have seen the Lincoln movie, and it perpetuates this same notion of the great white man theory of history. You know, it's almost nothing in the film about the role of the enslaved Africans, the essential role that they played in their own liberation, and even saving the so-called Union of the United States of America. Now, another important birthday is that the former Detroiter, Rosa Parks, this year, we commemorated on February the 4th, the centenary of her life. On December 1st of 1955, she was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama. She refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery and was arrested by the police for violating the segregation laws of the state of Alabama. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Parks was charged with violating the segregation laws of Alabama. Her arrest sparked the organization of the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for nearly a year, resulting in a Supreme Court decision which outlawed segregation in municipal transportation. And of course, that was a historic boycott. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of African Americans who refused to ride the bus. They organized their own rides. They walked. Even some of the women who worked doing domestic service in the homes of whites, some of those white women picked up, those black women and brought them to their homes because they didn't want to clean their own homes and take care of their own kids and cook their own food. So there was this split in the white family at that time because, those white women were dependent upon those African women for their own domestic chores. Now, Parks moved to Detroit in 1957 and continued to work as a seamstress. And in 1965, she began to work as an aide for Congressman John Conyers until her retirement. Just earlier this year, we kicked off the anniversary of the 50 years of the Detroit Walk to Freedom, which took place on June the 23rd of 1963. So therefore, 1963 as well as 1863 were watershed years in the struggle for African emancipation. Now, also in 1963, which I talk about in this article in the latest issue of Workers' World newspaper, there was mass demonstrations throughout the South as well as the North. Thousands were jailed, and many lost their lives, including Medgar Evers. 50 years ago, this coming June 12th, Medgar Evers, who was a field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, the organization that was co-founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, Evers was shot to death, by this man by the name of Byron De La Beckwith. He was a racist businessman in Mississippi. And he boasted about how he had shot Medgar Evers to death, and he went for 4 decades without even being convicted. He was eventually convicted several years ago in the state of Alabama. He thought he would never be convicted for the murder of Medgar Evers. Also in 1963, we also witnessed the first urban rebellion of the period, which took place in Birmingham, Alabama. This is history that's also not very well known. In May of that year, later in Birmingham, in September, 4 African-American girls would die when the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, a center for demonstrations that had engulfed the city earlier that year. And we just showed this documentary, Freedom on My Mind, which reviews a lot of the history of the civil rights struggle and the role of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Consequently, this is a significant year for historical reasons, but also for what is happening today in the city of Detroit and in other cities as well and around the world. And we will address these issues later on in today's discussion. Now, first of all, as I mentioned, African people in the United States resisted slavery. This is very important for us to understand. We don't see it in the movies generally, and even in the public education system, you don't hear that much about the African resistance to slavery. But at the same day that the Atlantic slave trade began, that's when the slave revolts began as well. African people are human beings, and when human beings are repressed, when they're exploited, when they're pushed, they're going to push back. Now, first of all, we have to examine the economic system of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. We must begin by recognizing the role of Africans themselves in the abolition of legalized bondage. Despite the earlier claims by revisionist bourgeois scholars, many of whom were ideological racists, Africans engaged in a centuries-long struggle against slavery. This struggle against slavery began on the African continent itself. This is also important to note. This is very important to point out because one of the most vicious lies told by these revisionist so-called scholars is that Africans were responsible for their own enslavement. The biggest lie that's ever been told. And that lie is continuing to this day, even in regard to the conditions of African people in the present period. We hear it every day in the media that Detroit, the people of Detroit, are responsible for the economic crisis. It's absurd. We're responsible, okay? We don't own any banks. We don't own any corporations. We didn't set those mortgages. We didn't make the deals that establish these credit default swaps and bond issues that we're trying to get the information released on now. Now, through our regular Marxism classes here in this building, we have been reading the seminal work by Dr. Rodney Riley entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's a great book, and we read it periodically here at the office. This is an historical and dialectical study of the impact of slavery and colonialism in the economic and social destruction of the African continent. Such studies contradict the long prevailing views, not only in regard to slavery and colonialism, but economic and social development in general. So this book is applicable not only to the African continental history, but also to world history as a whole, in general. Africans today on the continent and within the diaspora, meaning Africans who are scattered all over the world, in North America, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe, are still being blamed for their own oppression. Detroit is an excellent example of that. You know, here we are, we're the blackest city in the United States. Over 85% of the population here is African American. So what's happening to the people here in Detroit is not only scandalous, but it is a crime against humanity. In regard to the African resistance to slavery, there are numerous historians who have challenged, through primary source research, the assumptions that guided the academic approach to human bondage and colonialism. Bourgeois scholars have attempted to make it appear that Africans were content with the slave system. However, the African historians, such as Joseph E. Harris, noted, quote, "It was a combination of European attitudes about blacks and the demand for cheap labor that served the Atlantic slave trade and New World black slavery." He went on to say that when the Portuguese arrived in Africa, they began seizing Africans to take to Europe as, quote, curiosity pieces, unquote, which confirmed that the new land had been reached by the European explorers. The early African victims were honored in Portugal. They were taught Portuguese, and they were used as informants and guides for future Portuguese voyages to Africa. This was taking place during the mid-1400s, which is the 15th century. However, as the number of Africans increased in Lisbon, Portugal, they gradually were relegated to menial tasks, and by the middle of the 15th century, a lively trade in African labor developed. Thus, even before the Americas were settled by Europeans, Europe witnessed the development of black slavery, especially in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Sicily. And these are the areas, too, where mercantilism developed as well, which is a forerunner to capitalism, which we live under today. Monopoly capitalism and imperialism. However, despite the European demand for African labor, it has been recorded that as early as 1564, in the area that we know today as Sierra Leone in West Africa, a group of British traders led by a man named John Hawkins, you may have heard about him and read about him, were attacked by an army of indigenous African people who wounded several of these men and drove them from the inlands back to their ships on the coast of West Africa. By the time that these slave traders had reached the shores, some 200 Africans were awaiting them. The ensuing battle resulted in the deaths of 7 of Hawkins' most prized subordinates, including the captain of the ship known as the Salmon. This is in 1564. The king in this area then began to mobilize a larger contingent of his military forces, which propelled Hawkins and his survivors to retreat to their ships and sail back to the Caribbean. In another slave trading voyage, Hawkins was attempting to capture Africans along the Senegal River, which is in West Africa, when his group was attacked by the local people with bows and poisonous arrows. The Europeans then moved further east to avoid attack, eventually heading for the Spanish Main. After this disastrous episode, James Pope Hennessy pointed out that it was well into the next century before the British embarked upon slave expeditions again. Preferring less hazardous means of acquiring slave labor, the British began during the 17th century to attempt negotiations and trade as the principal method of obtaining Africans for exploitation in the newly established colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Such episodes of resistance during the 16th century were repeated during the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. So this is just an illustration, 2 illustrations of African resistance to the slave traders on the African continent before people were even brought here to the United States and brought to the Caribbean and Latin America. Now, according to an article published in the South Carolina Gazette on July 7 of 1759, this was during the colonial period of North American history, before the colonists broke away from Britain and formed the United States of America, which took place towards the end of the 18th century. We quote from the South Carolina Gazette from July 7, 1859. A slope commanded by a brother of Captain Azikiwe, slaving up the river of Gambia, was attacked by a number of the natives. This is what they're calling us natives. About the 27th of February last, and made a good defense, but the captain, finding himself desperately wounded and likely to be overcome, rather than fall into the hands of the merciless wretches, this is what they describe it as indigenous Africans, these are the Europeans, and likely to be overcome, rather than fall into the hands of the merciless wretches, when about 80 Negroes had boarded vessel, discharged a pistol into his magazine and blew her up. Himself and every soul on board perished, unquote. By providing these historical instances of resistance to slavery on the continent of Africa, it provides a basis for further research in order to more fully document the origins of Pan-African revolt in consciousness. These revolts took place in various parts of Africa, and then when people were brought here to the Western Hemisphere, these revolts continued. Since these actions by Africans in opposition to the Atlantic slave trade occurred in various regions of the continent, it illustrates that there was a pattern of response to the advent of European imperialism. Even during the height of the slave period in the Western Hemisphere, the relationships between Africans and their homelands would continue to occupy a prominent role in the political discourse on the question of legalized bondage and the status of the manumission of enslaved Africans. This is very, very important to point out. For example, some of the early religious institutions had the word African in them. The African Baptist Church, which was formed in South Carolina and Florida during the latter part of the 18th century. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, whose origins goes back to the 1780s and the 1790s. The African Methodist Episcopal Giant Church goes back to that same time period. This was years before the conclusion of chattel slavery in the United States. Africans in America still had a historic memory of the African continent and their African roots. Even the documentary, the feature film Roots, they showed it just recently over the holidays on BET. The principal character, maintained that his name was not Toby, that his name was Kuta Kinte. And he passed this on to his successors. So here again, we have to refute these myths about Africans being content with slavery. They forgot about their African culture and their African history. These are totally false, and we have mounds of documentation today to prove this. Inside colonial America, and eventually the United States, despite the false claims that Africans were satisfied with being the property of European slave owners and the ruling class, laws were enacted to restrict the movement of the enslaved population. These laws were enforced with the vengeance through harsh imprisonment, torture, and lynching. So, if Africans were content with being slaves, then why did they need to enact these harsh laws against them? It's a total contradiction. During the antebellum period, which meant the period after the decline of British colonialism and the advent of the independence of the United States colonies, in the late 18th century and the 19th centuries, the laws restricting the movements and expressions of African slaves increased in number and severity. So the more Africans they brought into the United States, the more laws to restrict them were created. In the southern border state of Tennessee, for example, laws were passed in 1803 which prohibited anyone to voice sentiments that could be interpreted as disrespectful to a slave owner, particularly in the presence of other slaves. Also, these same laws disallowed any language that advocated insurrection against the slave system. So, if people were not resisting slavery, then why would they enact laws to outlaw any discussion about insurrection? Any discussion or speeches related to the notions of emancipation, rebellion, or conspiracy fell under the rubric of this act. In an 1836 law in the same state mandated that any person distributing literature that encouraged disruption or insolence among Africans, slave or free, was committing an act of felony, punishable by 10 to 20 years in prison. So you could be, even if you were a slave, even if you were a so-called free black, you could still be locked up for another 20 years just for distributing literature calling for freedom, just for advocating freedom among your own people. Even racist Southern historians, such as Aldrich B. Phillips, and he was a Southern historian, and it's interesting that the Southern historians dominated the field of history for decades in the United States after the conclusion of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And particularly, the history of Reconstruction, the Civil War, and slavery was dominated by these Southern races. Aldrich B. Phillips was one of them. He, in fact, taught at the University of Michigan during the early part of the 20th century. He wrote a book entitled American Negro Slavery, a survey of the supply, employment, and control of Negro labor as determined by the plantation regime. It's a huge book, maybe 600 pages. And it's a very interesting book. Even though he was a racist, in reading the book, you can learn a lot about the system of slavery. Even a lie, you can learn from it. The character of a lie, you can learn a lot about the truth, interestingly enough. He does mention the passage of severe laws directed towards the maintenance of the slave system. Even though in the whole book he tries to make an argument that the slave system was relatively humane. But then he has a whole chapter on these laws that restricted, that restricted Africans and actually maintained the slave system. Although he provides his own rationale for these legal measures that parallels those ideals of the Southern slave owners of the period. He was actually an apologist for the planters, the slave owners. Phillips says, and I quote from this book, "Burning at the stake," this was during slavery, "breaking on the wheel," when they put people on a wheel and they, break their backs, rip their legs off and stuff. This is what was going on during slavery. And other ferocious methods of execution which were occasionally inflicted by the colonial courts, this is prior to the independence of the United States, were almost universally discontinued soon after the beginning of the 19th century. This is his contention. The general trend of moderation discernible at the time, however, was hampered then and thereafter by the series of untoward events, beginning with San Domingo, which is the Haiti Revolution. So the U.S. was influenced in terms of their legal system and their political system by the revolts beginning in 1791 in Haiti and the conclusion of the Haitian revolts, which concluded with a revolution in 1803, declaring themselves a republic in 1804, the first slave revolution, not just among Africans, but among world humanity and the history of humanity. It's the first time the slaves were able to organize, not only to rebel, because there have been rebellions, throughout the millennia by peasants and other exploited classes against their oppressors. But here we had in Haiti, in the 1790s and the early years of the 19th century, the 1800s, the organization of the slave population, the development of a military force, and the overthrow of their slave masters. They not only defeated the French, they had defeated the Spanish as well as the British prior to the total defeat of the French under Napoleon. And it so bankrupted the French colonial system that the so-called Louisiana Purchase was actually a result of the defeat of Napoleon in Haiti during the years of 1803. And it really, Haiti, of course, was the most prosperous slave colony in the world and was one of the most vicious slave systems in the world as well. Now, Phillips goes on to say the Haiti Revolution had an impact on U.S. Jurisprudence. He also says that, and ending up with John Brown's raid. So he draws a historical continuum between the Haitian Revolution and John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry in 1859. We're talking about over 5 decades. He says, in particular, the rise of the Garrisonian agitation. Of course, Garrison being one of the leading advocates of abolition. He had a newspaper called The Liberator, which began publishing in 1831, the same year that you had the Nat Turner Revolt. And that newspaper is still available in many libraries around the country right now. It's an excellent source of documentation on the struggle against slavery. And the quickly ensuing Nat Turner Revolt in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, shook up the entire slave system, where Nat Turner, an enslaved African, organized on his plantation, and people in other plantations. Their aim was to not only take over the plantations in their area, but also to spark a national rebellion against slavery. And they did kill many slave owners and others who tried to suppress this revolt. And they tried to say that Nat Turner was insane. And they tried to say that John Brown was insane. Okay? This is what the historians tried to shape him as being crazy, because somebody who thought they could rise up, organize and rise up against the slave system, they had to be crazy, right? But they were the most sane people of the period. And of course, he goes on to say, ensuing Nat Turner's revolt occasioned together a wave of reactionary legislation, the whole South over, prohibiting the literary instruction of Negroes, stifling the patrol systems, stiffening the patrol system, the so-called pack rollers, which the origins of the modern law enforcement is rooted in slavery. Restricting manumissions, that meaning that people who could eventually be emancipated by their masters under slavery, and diminishing the already limited liberties of free Negroes. So he's admitting, even though this guy's a racist, admitting that these revolts had an impact on the legal system in the United States, and that the movements of even those who were considered free among the African population was even restricted to a greater degree. So they really weren't free. The temper of administration, however, was not appreciably affected, for this clearly appears to have grown milder as the decades passed, unquote, which is a contradiction of what he just said. Consequently, it was the fear of rebellion during the 19th century that led to the increased violence directed against African people. By articulating this rationale, Phillips, perhaps unconsciously, provides a glimpse of the widespread discontent among Africans during the 19th century, and the heightened degree and level of extra-legal repression geared towards the suppression of the slaves and their counterparts. With the westward expansion of the territorial boundaries of the United States, the production of cotton became one of the principal industries within the American economy. This commodity, whose cultivation was conducive to the black belt soil of the regions of western Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and other areas, grew from the total amount of 9,000 bales. That's how they, measured cotton in bales. In 1791, right after the independence of the United States, only 9,000 bales of cotton were produced in the United States in 1791, to 79,000 bales at the beginning of the 1800s. By 1822, which was the same year of the Denmark-Vesey plot in South Carolina, another crazy African who plotted, to have an insurrection against slavery, the production of cotton had reached 500,000 bales, only to continue its precipitous rise to 1 million bales in 1831, the year of the Nat Turner Revolt, 2 million in 1840, 3 million in 1852, and in the year of succession, which was 1860, 1861, stood at the then enormous total of 5 million bales of cotton. And this has been documented by W.B. Du Bois in his book called Black Reconstruction in America that was published in 1935 at the height of the Great Depression. That book is about 600 pages. It's an excellent documentary history of slavery, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction period in the United States. So people who haven't read that book, they should definitely get it and read it. It's an excellent source for this history that we're reviewing today. According to Du Bois, in the book Black Reconstruction in America, and I'd like to quote this particular passage of the book. He says that, quote, "The giant forces of water, of steam were harnessed to do the world's work, and the black workers of America bent at the bottom of the growing pyramid of commerce and industry, and they not only could not be spared, if this new economic organization was to expand, but rather they became the cause of new political demands and alignments, of new dreams of power and visions of empire." So what he's saying, in his own poetic and eloquent fashion, that black workers, the labor of black workers, were essential to the economic development of the United States. He goes on to say their work called for the widening stretches of new rich black soil in the states of Florida and Louisiana, even in Mexico, even in Kansas. This land added to cheap labor and labor easily regulated and distributed made profits so high that a whole system of culture arose in the South with a new leisure and social philosophy. Black labor became the foundation stone not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. So the profits from the slave trade, from the production of cotton and other agricultural products that was stolen from the African people, actually provided the capital for the development of Northern manufacturing and commerce. New cities were built on the results of black labor, right here in the United States. Not to mention England. Eric Williams has a book called Capitalism and Slavery where he documents this in relationship to Britain. And a new labor problem involving all white labor arose both in Europe and America, because with the development of commerce and manufacturing, of course, you have the rise of the European working class. And of course, that contradiction kicked in as well, the contradiction between labor and capital. Now, it was the economic decline. The next part, I'm going to talk about the decline of slavery and the Civil War. Because at a certain point, in all exploitative systems, they began to decline. We can see that today with capitalism. At the time it was formed, it was somewhat progressive in the sense that it did liberate people from the slave system, from the feudal system. But at this point, capitalism is clearly in decline. If you look not only at the United States, you look at Western Europe, you look at where capitalism has had an impact in Africa, and Egypt right now. The source of the conflict that's going on there right now is the world capitalist crisis. Same thing in South Africa. Same thing in the Middle East, Asia. Capitalism is on the decline. The same thing happened with the slave system during the period around the 1850s. It was the economic decline of the slave system prior to the Civil War that played a central role in hardening the Southern planters' position against the supposed governmental favorism towards Northern industrial interests. They were saying that the Northern capitalists were being favored, which really was not true, but they were losing money during the 1850s because of the slave system. And this is documented in a book called The Political Economy of Slavery by Eugene Genovese. Leaders of an emerging manufacturing class argued that an increased expansion of mechanized production facilities would solidify a national economy in the United States. The succession of the southern states during the early months of 1861 initiated the war between the states. The consequent social disruption of the southern plantation system led to the mass flight of Africans from the plantations and small farms where they had been held in bondage. The decision to officially conscript Africans into the Union forces and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 by Lincoln's Republican administration, taking effect in 1863, effectively destroyed the antebellum slave system in the U.S. Even prior to the incorporation of Africans into the Union military, many deserted the plantations to join work crews within the Northern Army garrisons. So people, at the beginning of the Civil War, began to flee the plantation. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction described this process in a chapter entitled The General Strike. It's one of the early chapters in the book Black Reconstruction in America. He called it a general strike on the part of the African slaves. And we've been talking about a general strike over the last several months. Right here in the state of Michigan, we've been raising that question of the general strike. And we see it in Greece. They just had a general strike the other day in Greece against austerity. Francois Hollande, who is the president of France, who is now bombing Mali and has ground troops in Mali, and they're killing hundreds of people every week, even though there's a blackout there, we still can get the information. Went to Greece on a state visit just this past week, and when he got there, the workers were on strike. The people in the newspapers were on strike. They couldn't even cover his trip to Greece, because nobody was working at the newspapers in Greece. Now, Du Bois notes in this chapter entitled The General Strike, this was not merely the desire to stop work, he says. It was a strike on a wide basis against the conditions of work. It was a general strike that involved directly, in the end, perhaps 500,000 people. Now, there were approximately 4 million African slaves at the conclusion of the slave system in the beginning of the Civil War, and another 500,000, 500,000, who were considered free. They wanted to stop the economy of the plantation system. This is what Du Bois asserts. And to do that, they left the plantations, unquote. So this is significant to point out as well. So when we see movies like Lincoln, who say, Lincoln freed the slaves, well, the fact of the matter is, people were fleeing the plantations anyway prior to the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Du Bois goes on to point out, at first the commanders were disposed to drive them away. These are the northern military commanders. Or to give them quasi-freedom and let them do as they please with nothing that they possessed. This did not work. Then the commanders organized relief and afterwards worked. The Negroes were willing to work and did work, but they wanted land to work, and they wanted to see and own the results of their toil. So they wanted self-determination, they wanted land, and they wanted the fruits of their labor. Du Bois goes on to say it was here and in the West and South that a new vista opened. Here was a chance to establish an agrarian democracy. In the South, peasant holders of small properties eager to work and raise crops, amenable to suggestions and general direction. All they needed was an honesty in treatment and education. Wherever the conditions were fulfilled, the result was little less than phenomenal. This is liberated labor, semi-liberated labor. This was testified to by Pierce in the Carolinas, by Butler's agents in North Carolina, by the experiment in the Sea Islands in South Carolina, by Grant's Department of Negro Affairs under Eaton, and by Banks' direction of Negro labor in Louisiana. It is astonishing how this army of striking labor furnished in time 200,000 federal soldiers whose evident ability to fight decided the war. These are the Africans who went into the Union forces beginning in late 1862, and they were officially conscripted in 1863. According to Du Bois, these developments created the conditions perhaps for the most widely known and acclaimed Special Field Order number 15 by General Sherman, which provided 40 acres and a mule for the emancipated Africans in the Sea Islands. That's where this notion of 40 acres and a mule came from. It actually came out of the period of the Civil War, and because people were running away from the plantations and setting up their own farms and working and became very productive, General Sherman, one of the Union Army generals, issued Field Order number 15 and said, all the emancipated Africans should be given 40 acres and a mule in order for them to develop some type of economic independence. Well, we never got our 40 acres and we never got our mule. And we're still calling for reparations today. The resettlement of 30,000 Africans in the region was so successful that it led to the creation of other such experiments throughout the South, where the Union armies and the rebellions of Africans had destroyed the plantation system. This took place was taking place even prior to the Emancipation Proclamation and the conclusion of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. According to Du Bois, quote, the position of the Negro was strategic. His was the only appeal which would bring sympathy from Europe. Despite strong economic bonds with the South and prevent recognition of a Southern nation built on slavery, the free Negroes in the North, together with the abolitionists, were clamoring. To them, a war against the South simply had to be a war against slavery. And of course, England had very close ties with the planters in the South. However, eventually, the working class in England turned against slavery, began to organize against it, and they actually forced an embargo on cotton coming from the South. And Karl Marx played a role in this because he was living in England at the time. He wrote extensively on the Civil War for some of the leading newspapers in New York City. And his works are available. Marx's writing on the Civil War are available at marxist.org. You can pick them up online. In short, according to W.B. Du Bois, the Negro became, in the first year, a contraband of war. That is, the property belonging to the enemy and valuable to the invader. And in addition to that, he became, as the South quickly saw, the key to Southern resistance. Either these 4 million laborers remained quietly at work to raise food for the fighters, or the fighters starved. Simultaneously, when the dream of the North for manpower produced riots, the only additional troops that the North could depend on were 200,000 Africans. For without them, as Lincoln said, the North could not have won the war, unquote. That's very important to point out. You won't see that in the Lincoln film. No. You won't see that, no. But Lincoln even himself admitted that, if it had not been for the black troops, they could not have won the war. Because you had mass desertions, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit now, among the whites, particularly 1862, 1863. As the war proceeded, white northern labor became hostile towards the increasing presence of free African men and women who would compete with them for limited housing and employment. Widespread disaffection occurred among poor whites, whom after the enactment of the draft in 1863 deserted the Union Army by the thousands. In New York City, the poor and working class whites, many of whom were recent Irish immigrants, demanded the repeal of the draft after being influenced by huge segments of the Democratic Party press, which controlled a lot of the newspapers in New York City, which was pro-slavery. Now, even though they were based in the North, they supported the Southern Confederates, and they printed a whole lot of propaganda, against African people in these newspapers that were controlled by the Democratic Party in New York City, and they were supportive of the Confederate Rebellion. Now, when the draft law went into effect on July 13th of 1863 in New York, white mobs attempted to call a general strike among their fellow workers. Arson attacks were carried out in the city. Telegraph wires were severed, and government offices were torn down. The riot soon turned against the African community, who felt they were the cause of the war with the South. In a report issued by the Merchants Committee on Draft Riots, this was a congressional committee that was set up to investigate these. And in those days, when you use the term riots, it just meant, white mobs accompanied by law enforcement who went into black communities and robbed and raped and murdered people until they got tired. That's what the riots were considered in 1863. There were more in 1866 after the Civil War in Memphis as well as in New Orleans. It is stated that the African community was devastated by these wholesale attacks. The report read in part that, quote, driven by the fear of death at the hands of the mob, who the previous week had, as you remember, brutally murdered by hanging on trees and lampposts several of their number, and cruelly beaten and robbed many others, burning and sacking their houses, and driving nearly all of them from the streets, alleys, and docks upon which they had previously obtained honest, though humble livings. These people had been forced to take on refuge on Blackwell's Island, at police stations on the outskirts of the city, in the swamps and wood banks of Bergen, New Jersey, at Weeksville, and the barns and outhouses of the farmers of Long Island and Marisano. At these places were scattered some 5,000 homeless men, women, and children, unquote, and that was in 1863, after the so-called draft riots of 1863. Recruitment of African troops accelerated after the battle at Fort Wagner. By the end of the war, there were at least 154 regiments of black troops, which included 140 infantry units. According to Du Bois, quote, official figures say that there were in all 186,017 Negro troops, of whom 123,000 were still in service by July 16 of 1865. This was a couple of months after the ending of the Civil War. And that the losses during the war were 68,178. So 68,000 black men died in the Civil War fighting for the destruction of slavery. Amazing. People liberated themselves. They weren't waiting, for the great Abraham Lincoln to liberate them. They took part in 198 battles and skirmishes. Without doubt, including servants, laborers, and spies, between 300,000 and 400,000 Negroes helped as regular soldiers or laborers in winning the Civil War. People like Harriet Tubman, who this year we're commemorating the centenary of her passing, was known for her work in the Underground Railroad of liberating enslaved Africans, but she was also instrumental in the Civil War, as a spy, also as an operative of the Union Army. Consequently, the abolition of slavery would not have been possible without the self-direction and self-organization of African people themselves. Du Bois stresses that by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, hundreds of thousands of such slaves were already free by their own actions, and that of the invading armies, and in their cases, Lincoln's proclamation only added possible legal sanction to an accomplished fact, unquote. Now, after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, and this next section is on Reconstruction and the failure of democracy in America. By the conclusion of 1863, it was becoming clear that the Union forces were heading towards victory in the Civil War. This fact posed numerous challenges as it relates to the post-war Reconstruction of the United States. Nearly 1 year after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, President Lincoln, on December 8th of 1863, published, and a lot of people know about the Emancipation Proclamation, but a lot of people don't know about the December 8th, 1863 Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction that was issued by Lincoln, which proposed a comprehensive pardon to any Confederate member and leader who would take an oath in support of the Constitution of the United States and the unity of the states. The only exceptions were officers in the Confederate Army and Navy who held rank above colonel and lieutenant and had withdrawn from commission in the United States military and assisted with the rebellion of the slaveholding states. So they were already thinking, how can they, bring these people back into the Union? In addition to those who left the judiciary and Congress to aid the Confederate rebellion, and people who treated Africans or whites other than prisoners of war would not be immediately eligible for pardons. Once 10% of the people within the former Confederate states had pledged allegiance to the Union, the state could be readmitted. So they only wanted 10%, of the whites in the Confederate states. If they pledged allegiance to the United States Constitution, they could be readmitted into the United States. Interestingly enough, Africans who had literally saved the Union through their rebellion against the slave system and participation in the Union war effort were not included in this proposal for the restoration of full citizenship rights. So they didn't include our ancestors. They provided, initially they provided provisions for the restoration of citizenship for the Confederates. But our people, who in fact determined the outcome of the war, they were not included in this proposal. Africans were excluded from oath-taking. They were excluded from voting, let alone holding office, and consequently the state and federal governments would be composed of white men only. This was the plan a year prior to the conclusion of the Civil War. Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction set off a tumultuous debate within Congress. Thaddeus Stevens, who was known as one of the radical Republicans during the Reconstruction period, said that the Lincoln plan was preposterous. African communities in various states liberated during the war made appeals for citizenship rights and universal suffrage, but no promises were made. In November of 1863, free men of color in New Orleans appealed to Governor Shepley and later General Banks asking to be allowed to register and vote, and they were summarily rejected. Therefore, by the time of the assassination of Lincoln on April 15th of 1865, the question of the future of political status of the former enslaved Africans was by no means settled. This is at the end of the war. So what were they going to do with these 4.5 million Africans, many of whom had participated in the Civil War to end slavery and to actually preserve the United States of America? With the conclusion of the war and the death of Lincoln, the Confederate officials were rapidly pardoned and given prominent roles within state government. African-American historian John Hope Franklin observed in his book, Reconstruction After the Civil War, that, quote, "It is nevertheless remarkable how rapidly under the circumstances demobilization of federal troops occurred and with what speed they were removed from southern soil." This is very interesting too, because this whole notion that was promoted by these southern historians of Reconstruction made it appear as if the federal troops remained in large numbers in the South during the period of the late 1860s and all the way to the mid-1870s. But if you look at the actual documentation, this was not true. In November of 1865, just several months after the conclusion of the war, the Secretary of War could report that because of the rapid establishment of civil governments in the South, meaning the restoration of these Confederates to power in the South, the military force of the federal government had been greatly reduced. Large armies disbanded, and nearly a million brave men paid and honorably mustered out of service. So even before 1865 was over, they had already engaged in large-scale demobilization of the Union Army. Franklin continued pointing out that, quote, "Within a year, there were only 11,000 white and Negro volunteers still in arms, and the strength of the regular army stood at 54,000 men. Indeed, by June 1st of 1866, there were only 200 officers and 2,973 enlisted men in North and South Carolina, which was one of the major former slave states. And every Negro soldier in Mississippi had been mustered out of the service." This is by 1866. So they had demobilized, the overwhelming majority of these black troops who were so essential to the war effort. And even the white troops, most of them had already been withdrawn from the South and demobilized. White Confederates complained that the presence of African troops was an insult to their status and dignity. The federal government under President Johnson at that time, who took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, responded to these sentiments on the part of the Southerners, because Johnson himself was from the South. He was from Tennessee, and he was not anti-slavery. He wanted to preserve the Union. He thought the Confederates what they did was disastrous, and it brought about the economic ruin of the South. So that's why he didn't support secession. Consequently, the notion that still exists today that the Union forces had an overwhelmingly presence in the former Southern states is unsubstantiated. Franklin stresses that, quote, "Even casual examination of the report of the Secretary of War for 1865 and 1866 clearly establishes the fact that post-war mobilization was rapid and that only a skeletal military force was in the South by the end of 1866, unquote. The much Confederate criticized Freedmen's Bureau, many of us have heard about the Freedmen's Bureau, that was created by Congress before the end of the war to aid the emancipated, formerly enslaved Africans, provided medical care to about 450,000 people. They provided 21 million rations to whites who were displaced, as well as African freedmen. Nonetheless, following the insistence of President Johnson, only 30,000 people displaced by the war were settled, and most of the land seized by the Union Army was returned to the Southern slave owners. So the Union Army seized their land during the course of the war, but then they turned around and gave it right back to them after the conclusion of the war. Franklin notes that, quote, "After the passage of the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, the Bureau hoped to assist Negroes in obtaining farms under its terms. The lands that were opened upward, for the most part, inferior and unattractive," unquote. So they gave the best land back to the slave owners. Perhaps the most success of the Freedmen's Bureau was its assistance in the establishment of educational institutions for African Americans. We had the historically black colleges, the K-12 institutions in the South, and a lot of those were set up by missionary groups and people who came as volunteers from the South. Several industrial schools and colleges were established in the aftermath of the war, but they by no means met the demand or needs of the 4.5 million people of African descent. It was great that these schools were set up, but they by no means even touched the need, for mass education of the formerly enslaved population. By no means did the Bureau overturn the rule of the former slave-owning class. It's a total myth. The hostility towards its activities by President Andrew Johnson severely hampered the Bureau's mission. Johnson himself was hostile towards the Freedmen's Bureau. The state governments established between 1865 and 1867 were dominated by former Southern Confederates who passed black code laws. This was between 1865 and 1867. That maintained white dominance and the denial of due process to African people. It was not until the elections of 1866 and the actions of the radicals and their allies in Congress during 1867 was there some movement in regard to granting citizenship rights to Africans and organizing the South into military districts. Initially, they had no intentions of doing this under President Johnson. And of course, Johnson was outraged by the assumption of authority by Congress for Reconstruction. He wanted to maintain control of Reconstruction. But the radicals within Congress and others were totally against what he was doing. Later, he barely escaped impeachment and fell from political grace by the end of 1867. It's one of the few periods in history, and we saw this under the Clinton administration, where he was actually impeached by Congress, but they have to put you on trial in the Senate, and they didn't have enough votes, so they dismissed the charges against him back during the late 1990s. The same thing happened to Andrew Johnson in 1867. By the time he left office at the end of 1868, Johnson had issued a general amnesty for the former Confederate leadership. So these people were never held accountable for not only slavery, but they were never held accountable for the crimes they committed for breaking up the Union and also the war crimes that were committed during this period. During this period, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting citizenship rights for the former slaves, and by 1869, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to African Americans. So it wasn't until 1868 that Africans were supposedly made citizens of the United States. 3 years after the war ended, and 5 years after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, we'll get to that. Another 100 years, for them to even, well, they said we're free now, but we'll talk about this in the conclusion. Yes. It was not until 1870, 5 years after the war was over, 7 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, that the first African Americans entered the U.S. Congress. 1870. And they were Joseph H. Rainey from South Carolina and Huron rebels of Mississippi. They entered Congress in 1870. However, at the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee by Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a former slave trader. He was originally from Mississippi. He had businesses in Memphis and other parts of Tennessee. He made a tremendous amount of money during the 1850s and 1860s as a slave trader. You can go to Memphis today and you can still see the slave blocks down on the docks of the Mississippi River. He also, after the Civil War began, he became a general in the Confederate Army, Nathan Bedford Forrest. They have a park named after him in Memphis, and there was some discussion recently about changing the name of the park. He was also responsible for one of the most egregious atrocities of the war committed at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, where hundreds of enslaved and African troops, as well as Union whites, were massacred. Fort Pillow, Tennessee, 1864, one of the most horrendous massacres of the Civil War. The Klan was organized openly in states throughout the South and battled the Reconstruction process. So Bedford Forrest was a slave trader. He was a general in the Confederate Army. He was responsible for the Fort Pillow massacre, and then, after the war was over, he was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Eventually in 1876, as a result of the disputed national presidential election of that year, the federal government largely abandoned the Reconstruction policy. Although in several states, including Tennessee, South Carolina, and North Carolina, African Americans would continue to hold office through the 1880s and 1890s. Now this was on a state level and a local level. We still had some state representation. In Tennessee, even in the 1880s, you had 12 African American state representatives there. Most of them were from the western part of the state where cotton production was so prevalent during slavery. But they were eventually driven out of office by the end of the 1880s. In South Carolina, it was a similar situation. In North Carolina, I think a few people still lasted up until around 1900, 1901. By the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the experiment in democracy had been completely overthrown. Lynching became common throughout the South and many areas in the North. Thousands of African Americans were summarily beaten, tortured, and killed. Peonage, sharecropping, tenant farming, contract labor laws created conditions that were analogous to those that prevailed during slavery. And there's a documentary that was shown just recently about the contract labor system after the Civil War and Reconstruction, where people could be picked up for vagrancy. You know, because if you were a black man and you know, they stopped you and you didn't say I work for Mr. So-and-so, or you may just be standing around, you know, joking or something on the street, they could actually arrest you for vagrancy, put you in prison, and then sell you to a contract laborer. You know, where you had no rights, you got no income, and this was in essence slavery. Many black men died in these work crews. They worked on plantations. Some of them worked even in industrial production and other services. So the slave system actually continued in many ways after the conclusion of the Civil War. In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision and consolidated federal law in favor of legalized segregation, saying that separate but equal is constitutional. They remembered the separate part, but they totally forgot about the equal part. It would take until 1954, we're talking about almost 6 decades later, for this decision to be reversed with specific reference to public education, the Brown versus Topeka case in Kansas in 1954. A mass civil rights struggle beginning in December of 1955 set the stage for a renewed effort to eradicate American apartheid. The first federal law in support of equality was passed in 1957. Since the 1870s, you had several civil rights acts. The Civil Rights Act of 1866. There was another one in 1870, 1871, I believe. But you know, they were largely forgotten about after the conclusion of the 1870s. So in 1957, there was the passage of the first Civil Rights Act since the 1870s. And that act related to the ability of the Justice Department to enforce voting rights. By 1960, students would take the lead through the sit-in movement and the freedom rides to militantly make a move towards the eradication of legalized segregation and universal suffrage. By 1963, this militancy would initiate a series of urban rebellions beginning in Birmingham and continuing through hundreds of cities by 1970. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this all grew out of a mass civil rights struggle. Many people died, many people were beaten, many people were tortured, many people were driven off their land, driven out of their homes, forced to leave the South and come north into other parts of the country just to enact limited reforms in the South as well as the North. Because you had segregation in the North too, even here in the city of Detroit. As late as the early 1960s, there were restaurants that people couldn't even go into in downtown Detroit. One, Greenfield's Restaurant, the building is still standing over on Woodward and Temple. Now it's a Vietnam Veterans office. It used to be Greenfield's Restaurant. It was a very popular restaurant in Detroit. And my understanding is African Americans couldn't even go in that restaurant, even as late as the early 1960s. Nonetheless, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown had all agreed by 1967 that there must be a fundamental transformation of the political and economic system and a repeal of the foreign policy of imperialism by the United States. By this time, the intransigence of the U.S. ruling class had struck back. In a similar fashion, as the post-Civil War period through the counterintelligence program and the policy of benign neglect. And the whole concept of benign neglect was credited to a man by the name of Moynihan, who was a Democrat, in fact. And he said, we should just ignore, the problem of the oppression of African Americans, and then eventually it would just go away. Just ignore it. He also wrote this book that was really an attack on African American women, saying that the problem with the African American community is that it is a matriarchy, that the women are too strong in the families, and that the real struggle is to strengthen the role of the black man in the black family. It was really an attack, on all those women, who are out working and raising children and contributing to the community and to their households. Well, this is kind of propaganda that Daniel Moynihan was putting out. I think this book was published in 1965. But he was a close ally of Lyndon Johnson. Now, in conclusion, I would just like to relate all of this history of the slave period, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction period, the Civil Rights Movement, to what is going on today. Because we're facing monumental challenges right now, not only in Detroit, but throughout the entire country. Today, we have the advantage of looking back at the historical developments of the Reconstruction and Civil Rights eras of African American history. At present, the world capitalist system headed by the United States is facing the worst crisis since the Great Depression. Even though there have been monumental changes within the political and economic system within the United States and the world since the slave period, fundamentally, America is still a class-dominated society, with the corporations and the banks dominating all social institutions. The white-only signs have been removed, but the barriers to social progress and genuine freedom have remained erected. The federal government, indices through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, through the U.S. Census Bureau indicate that poverty and structural unemployment is rising among African Americans and other nationally oppressed groups. The census laid it out clear over the last couple of years. Poverty is increasing among African Americans, even under a president who self-identifies as an African American. This is not my statistics. These are not the statistics of Workers' World Party. These are the U.S. Census Bureau statistics. Indicate this is the government itself. If you read their reports of the last several years, poverty is increasing among the African American people. So an important fact to take notice of. Structural unemployment is increasing as well. We can see it clearly here in the city of Detroit. This is occurring under the leadership of a self-identified African American president who represents the Democratic Party, which many people within the African American community identify with. Has the political culture in the United States changed in regard to how African Americans are viewed within the mass media and the dominant social groups and classes? It's a very important question. As during the period of Reconstruction and its aftermath, the racist notions of inferiority still exist within the corporate media and the educational system. All we have to do is pick up the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News every day, and we see the same stereotypical images, the same rationales, the same racist arguments that are made in regard to the plight of the city of Detroit. They don't say blacks, they don't say African Americans, but we know we're the majority here in the city of Detroit. We know that. In the aftermath of Reconstruction and the Southern historians sympathetic to the slave system dominated the interpretation of this social experiment. We talked about this earlier. Southern historians dominated the field of history, particularly the field that dealt with slavery and Reconstruction and the Civil War. A century later, the educational system and the corporate media minimizes and distorts the meaning of the civil rights and black power movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We see it every year. During Black History Month, Martin Luther King's birthday. Therefore, one aspect of raising political consciousness is to provide an historical materialist view of race relations and national oppression in the United States and the world. This is why we initiated, through Macaulay, the Martin Luther King Day in Detroit in 2004. We did it to resurrect the actual life of Dr. Martin Luther King related to his anti-war and social justice legacy. All they do is show that 10-minute clip, 10-second clip, I Have a Dream. Reduce Dr. King to a 10-second clip on television. And they eliminate the entire Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress on Racial Equality, the NAACP, the mass demonstrations, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the urban rebellions, the election of black elected officials during the 60s, 70s, and so forth. All that is eliminated. And they reduce the entire history of struggle of African Americans to a 10-second clip on Dr. King's federal holiday. And we've been working to change that in regard to Dr. King when we initiated Martin Luther King Day in 2004. This year was the 10th consecutive year that we've organized Martin Luther King Day in the city of Detroit. And in doing that, we bring to the community, we bring them together, and we bring people to the community, activists, strugglers, organizers, people who are active today, who have been active in the past, in fighting against these forms of racism and oppression. This year we had C.D. Witherspoon, president of the Baltimore Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a youth minister who is carrying on the legacy of Dr. King through his own organization that King founded in 1957. Last year we had some leading organizers, women organizers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The year before that, we had Willie Ricks, Mukasa Dara, the one who raised the slogan of Black Power in Mississippi in 1966, who was a SNCC organizer, who worked closely with Dr. King, as well as Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. We do this every year because we realize the masses make history. Individuals don't make history. This necessity exists as well for the periods of slavery, Reconstruction, and the upsurge of the mid to late 20th century. The ruling class will always distort the history of the workers and the oppressed for its own benefit, aimed at continuing the exploitation and oppression of its natural adversaries. We are the natural class enemies of the ruling class. One point of continuity of the ruling class interpretation of history is the notion that African Americans cannot rule themselves or others within society. The racist historians of slavery and Reconstruction claim that the system of bondage was well suited to the African American people. According to them, Reconstruction politicians and organizations are portrayed as inherently corrupt and inefficient. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, right.
Read the Detroit News, read the Free Press, read their editorials every day. People in Detroit can't govern themselves. The crisis that was fostered by the corporations and the banks through their racist predatory lending practices, through the deindustrialization of the city of Detroit, is at the root of the crisis.
Right.
But you never know that by reading the Detroit News or the Free Press or watching the local news programs. No. And that's why we filed a lawsuit 2 weeks ago, to get the documents from these bond issues and from these credit default swaps, and we haven't heard a word from them. We hear escalation in the propaganda against Detroit, but they won't come clean with their documents, because they know in those documents is the real truth about what happened to the city of Detroit. Consequently, the dominant ruling interests are compelled to take control of the system completely for the good of not only the oppressed, but also for the dominant social class. So they have to take over Detroit, appoint an emergency manager from outside for our own good, okay, and for their good as well, okay. We witness this on a daily basis in the city of Detroit. The corporate media narrative says that Detroit is facing financial ruin due to the corruption and lack of management skills of the majority African American population. We don't know how to manage, we don't know how to administer. That is at the root cause. But what is at the root cause of the national crisis? What is at the root cause of the world economic crisis, where we don't have any influence or control over it? Who's been running the store? Who almost bankrupted the capitalist system 5 to 6 years ago, which had to be bailed out to the tune of at least $14 trillion from central banks, from governmental institutions, not only in this country, but throughout Western Europe. However, the corporations and the banks which have robbed and exploited people in Detroit for decades are never criticized. In fact, they are viewed as the key component of the solution to the crisis. This is an ideological position that attempts to legitimize the continuing racism and national oppression fostered by the capitalist system. Our contribution in this period is to vociferously attack these views without mercy. And this is what we do through our newspaper, through our leaflets, through our meetings, through our mass work. There's much data and historical record to support our position that the crisis in Detroit And the United States and the world is rooted in a system of profit that is continuing to exploit the workers and oppressed at ever greater levels. The situation in Detroit mirrors the world economic crisis. The astronomical rates of joblessness. We talked about Spain, Greece, Italy, France. Even in France, where they're going and bombing Africa, since last month, the unemployment rate officially is above 11%. Also, escalating indebtedness to the banks. Greece, they were caught up in the same type of credit default swaps and predatory loans that people here in the city of Detroit were subjected to. See the same thing in Spain, where people have been working for months without pay, civil servants, hoping that one day they'll be paid retroactively. They don't have money to even buy food. This is in Europe that this is going on. But you don't see that. They don't compare what's going on in Spain and Greece and Italy and Belgium and France and even now in Britain, where they just lowered their credit worthiness. Standard & Poor's said that their credit worthiness was lowered as well. But there's a double side to that. They lower your credit worthiness, and what does that mean? You have to impose greater austerity measures on the workers. That's just the key for the banks to even screw the people even more in Britain. And this is what's going on. Rising state repression. It's another key aspect of it. The National Defense Authorization Act, the Military Commissions Act, the Homeland Security Acts, the Patriot Act. All of these acts are really, although they claim they're to fight the so-called Islamist terrorists and the Al-Qaeda. But these laws have been used against U.S. citizens. They've killed U.S. citizens. Imam Lukman, was murdered right here in the city of Detroit, 2 years ago in Dearborn. Yeah, he was murdered by the federal government. It was a targeted assassination, and they did absolutely nothing about it. The Justice Department did a review, and they exonerated the agents that were involved in his murder. And the agents who carried out his murder were trained in Quantico, Virginia, a counterterrorism training facility in the southern part of the United States. Also, the inability of the ruling class to provide any rational answers and effective solutions. They provide no solutions. You don't even hear anything about any solutions to the crisis. They don't talk about we need to create full employment. We need to eliminate poverty. We need to eliminate all these social ills of society. We need to educate everybody. We need to lower the cost of consumer goods and housing and loans and all this. You never hear that coming from the ruling class at all. 3.5 years ago, we had the People's Summit in Tent City, downtown at Grand Circus Park. And it got tremendous press coverage locally, nationally, as well as internationally. Public broadcasting system, they contacted us, and they wanted me to write an essay to go up on their website, PBS website, on what we actually were saying with the People's Summit, and what we thought could be a solution to the economic crisis. Because we did the People's Summit in response to this National Business Summit that brought these billionaires here who met. They first were going to meet at Ford Field, and they decided to meet at the Renaissance Center. So I wrote an essay. I wrote an essay, and it went up. It's still up on their website. And they asked the people from the National Business Summit to write an essay as well on what they saw as being the solution to the problems. So I wrote the essay. They put it up on their website. The National Business Summit never wrote an essay because they have no solutions to the crisis. The whole Occupy Wall Street movement. You never saw one coherent and rational statement that came from the bankers in response to the Occupy Wall Street movement, because they know their position is indefensible. What are they going to say? Anyway. Consequently, it is our task to not only seek answers to the pressing questions of the day, but to grapple with a political program of action. The system must be uprooted and fundamentally transformed. Reform is no longer, it's not a long-term option, brothers and sisters. And I'm saying this in conclusion. The system is a problem and must be destroyed to make way for the new one based upon the needs of the majority of people and within society. This is a lesson of the struggle against slavery, against Jim Crow, against domestic neocolonialism under which we live today. War is the outgrowth of the profit system and cannot be eliminated without challenging the system at its root. The challenge must involve us all. Please join us in these efforts. Thank you so much for your patience and indulgence. And thank you everybody for coming out.
you could expand on New York City during the draft riots. You said that the Democratic Party controlled the media and was pro-slavery.
Yeah, right.
Could you expand on that a little more? Because isn't it true that Wall Street was pro-slavery at the time because it got most of its profits? And it would make sense. They controlled papers. So they would have the papers articulate a position that was against the Union or the South. You know much more about that?
Yeah, I know that they had slavery in New York, even during the colonial period. In fact, slavery was much stronger in New York and Rhode Island and the Northeast in the Hudson area, Hudson River Valley area, than it was in the South during that particular time period. But yes, there was close links between finance capital and the planters in the South, and also among the industrialists in Britain as well. So the ruling class was definitely split, over the question of slavery inside the United States. And you can see, there's a film entitled The Gangs of New York, Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah.
People ever seen that film?
Yeah.
It actually concludes with the New York draft riots of 1863. So deals with the Irish immigrants who came into the United States and how they were manipulated, by the government and by the ruling class at the time, and they were struggling as well. But they tried to manipulate them against the struggle to end slavery. Yes, but of course there was close ties between finance capital, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the profits accrued from the Atlantic slave trade and from the slave system actually provided the capital for the industrialization of the North, as well as industrialization in Europe, in Britain. And Eric Williams, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, documents it very well. The book was written in 1943-44 as a doctoral dissertation at Oxford University. He was from Trinidad, Eric Williams. And he breaks it down for each industry. He talks about shipping, he talks about manufacturing, has a huge section in there on banking as well. So it's very interesting to read that book, Capitalism and Slavery, and see the connection between the Atlantic slave trade and the rise of industrial capitalism. Joyce.
Isn't it true also that I have read something earlier that Lincoln himself did not believe blacks and whites could unite in the same entity or country, and that in fact he had intended, even with the proclamation, to send blacks to Panama.
Yes, that was one option. You're most definitely right. He was not an advocate of full citizenship, and as I mentioned, the proclamation, for Reconstruction that was issued initially in late 1863. That's not that well publicized. African Americans were not included in that proposal. They had no intentions of giving us full, quote, citizenship rights, unquote, the right to vote, the right to due process, to hold office, to get equal pay for equal work. That was not in the cards. And he didn't believe in full equality. In fact, he was, opposed to the utilization of Africans in the Union Army. It was the concrete conditions of the war which forced them. The generals saw, what was going on in the field. And when they saw, the self-organization and self-direction of the Africans who had escaped, from the plantations, they said, yeah, we need to, and when the whites were deserting, by the hundreds of thousands, from the Union forces, and they were actually losing the war. And then, of course, they said, well, we have to incorporate, the former enslaved Africans into the war effort. And that's what actually brought about the changing of the course of the Civil War. So it was the concrete conditions that actually brought about, the end of slavery. And as I mentioned earlier, too, initially, even after the war, it took up to 3 years for even the 14th Amendment to pass, which actually granted citizenship. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, which constitutionally, abolished slavery. But what good is it to be free if you don't have citizenship rights? It's no good. You can't serve on juries, don't have a right to due process, none of this. So that didn't pass, until 1868, and then of course in 1869 the 15th Amendment, which ostensibly granted the right of African Americans to vote. And it wasn't until 1870 that you had the first African Americans who entered the U.S. Congress. So it was a process, and there was tremendous resistance to it because these Southerners were still, they were partying. Land was turned back to them, and they fought Reconstruction tooth and nail. They formed the Ku Klux Klan. They had other terrorist organizations at the time as well, and we saw what happened, after the elections of 1876, and it took another century for any semblance of civil rights and voting rights to actually be enacted inside the United States, and that had a lot to do, of course, with the mass struggles of African Americans, with the rise of the socialist camp, Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and also the national liberation movements in Africa and even Latin America. Leroy,
When you mentioned about Abraham Lincoln saying about the concrete against him or what forcing him to act, he actually commented on that concept by saying, I did not control events controlled me. He's referring to that very clever way without saying specifically what would be appropriate. And earlier you mentioned about the slave of Noah. There was a recent essay on John Hartman who said that the Second Amendment break their arms and hold them right with his wife. The purpose of that was to enable the slave control to continue. Because after they put the Constitution in, they had a second thought, oh my God, if Congress the power to take the military, they can do as they please, they can take weapons, they can do whatever. So when they put the Second Amendment in this cases, for the purpose of the Constitution was to break those slave controls. Else they could all be federalized, but then not in terms of liberalizing the National Guard. So the purpose was to take the slavery against black people who were enrolled in it. Obviously, on a regular basis, that's why the Americans did not have the slave controllers. Now, I want to put a plug in King George II. King George II had a civil war just like we had in the 1740s in Scotland. He didn't do like Abraham Lincoln. So we got all those badges being charged 10% so it was another nice man, King George II. That's what the public community message of George III to get down to loose. He ordered shoot all the Southerners, all the Scottish Confederates. Kill them all, kill their women and children, all the families of the troops. Absolute total devastation. There was a movie made in England maybe 40 years ago saying how awful that was. If you study history, you see the get rid of the lynch mobs and the traitors and the people who are extremely dangerous who believe in Saturday were better than other people who are the masters of the slaves. In history, it's notorious that Scotland was a much better, more progressive society than it could ever have been when they were out there Confederates like to continue. So I never say that we should do that. Lincoln really made a terrible error. It was an outrageous decision.
Yes, and we don't know, what Lincoln would have done. He was assassinated at the conclusion of the war. But so we can't really, predict. We couldn't, in retrospect, say what he would have done if he had been able to serve out his term, his second term. But we saw, where Andrew Johnson, in his attempts to stifle the Reconstruction process, and then when Grant got in and the efforts of the radicals in Congress, there was some movement. But many of those movements had to do with the own self-interest of the Republican Party and others, who wanted to suppress, the Southern former slaveholder class. David?
Yeah, this Lincoln question is very complex.
Yeah.
It's not, absolutely everything everyone said is correct. And Karl Marx recognized it in his writing and saying, but he credited Lincoln for however reluctantly and slowly and agonizingly finally doing what needed to be done. And that was how Marx recognized Lincoln as carrying out certain progressive, quote unquote, action, if not quickly, at least somewhat, he did it slowly. But we should also remember that on Lincoln's right was the tremendous pro-Southern, in the North, pro-Southern sympathies, not just in Wall Street. General McClellan, who was placed in charge of the Northern forces, Union Army, he was a terrible general. He was a good organizer, but he was not against the slave system. He wasn't against his old pals who were now running the Confederate Army. And he didn't carry out any military actions to really speak of. But he was plotting to overturn Lincoln. There was talk of making him a Caesar, a dictator, seizing power. And Lincoln was maneuvering with these guys, against these guys, and that's laid out in that book we were reading called The Long Road to Antietam, which was the first pretty good big victory of the North, and then following that, Lincoln decided to go ahead, he could go ahead and issue a proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. But up to that, and then he fired McClellan. So McClellan looked like for a while he was going to seize power over and overthrow Lincoln. So it was a very complex situation, and like you said, it was really the masses who were, decisive in all this.
Yeah.
Jerry?
Yeah, Jerry, Wolf, and Lee. Jerry.
I know when I first read Black Reconstruction, it was the first time I'd ever read and saw the struggle against for liberation of slaves, based on the concept of a general strike against slavery. That the liberation was accomplished by the slaves and eventually ratified by the Emancipation Proclamation, not the other way around. And that's, I think, a great lesson for us in history, because that every single gain for the workers and oppressed people is gained through the struggle, is gained and usually ratified later, usually in an attempt to contain the victory by the ruling class, whether it's the civil rights movement. And you think the civil rights movement with Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, who was a historic racist from way back and a murderer of the Vietnamese. He was the author of the Civil Rights Bill, and the civil rights were implemented by the sit-down strikes. The unions were implemented by the workers taking over the pay. And it's a very important, I think, that's been lost on people today. The problem we have in this era is people see their struggle as defined by the parameters of those in power for the exploiters over and again. And they try to set the limits, and we've seen it in the emergency manager struggle, which is confined to a struggle over who's going to implement the policy of the banks, whether the city council should be able to do it or whether they need an emergency manager. The meeting we had on tax the other day was very interesting because Szymanski, who was the treasurer, and he's kind of a liberal, and he was there to, we're fighting for the people. And when we confronted him and said, well, fine, put a moratorium to halt every single tax foreclosure, he couldn't do it. He opposed it. Wouldn't do it, because that's what we're up against. The ruling class is there to defend their system, and even the most liberal spokespersons for their system are still there to defend their system. It's the working class that has to break the bounds of that system and define our own struggle in our own terms, and that's our history. And Du Bois. To me, when I read that book, it was a mind-blowing book because you never read about the struggle against slavery in those terms. That it was a struggle from below. It wasn't as Abayomi did so well. It wasn't some political leaders who did it, or even the changes in the social character wasn't what was decisive. It was the intervention of the people themselves that was decisive. And that's what we have to get back to today and learn that we define what we need. We don't let these politicians and spokespeople and people, all of whom are defending the ruling class, whether they're liberals or Republicans, it doesn't really matter. They're for the status quo, and we have to break through it based on our own interests. If we can't do it in Detroit, I don't know where we can do it.
Exactly. And if you look, even after the end of slavery in the United States, you still had slavery in Cuba, which didn't end until 1878, but it was after a 10-year struggle for independence that you had the end of slavery in Cuba. And in Brazil, slavery didn't end until 1888. So in Cuba, it still went on 13 years after the end of slavery in the United States. And in Brazil, it went on another 23 years after the end of slavery in the United States. In Brazil, it was a struggle against the monarchy. They were independent. They got their independence from Portugal, but it was under a monarchy. And it was a struggle against the monarchy in 1888, which created the conditions for the end of slavery in Brazil. So, these tumultuous struggles and civil war and, struggles for independence and stuff are actually, at the root of fundamental social change. Lee and then Wolf. And then, okay, all right. Lee, you want to go ahead?
You mentioned that the slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule. Not only that, but the ones that fought in the Civil War had a right to 40 acres and a mule. And there are farms right in northern part of Lower Peninsula, Michigan, whose family are descendants from somebody who fought in the Civil War, white people, of course, who fought in the Civil War and were given the farm, 40 acres, and I dare say a mule. So, black African people who now are being foreclosed on actually are owned by the system for 39 3/4 acres and a mule.
Of course. No question about it. No question about it. And that's a whole nother story.
There we go. It's
a whole nother story.
They got to amend their complaints.
Exactly. And that's a whole nother story because African Americans did accumulate several million acres of land in the South, even despite the racism and the refusal of them to acknowledge that. During the early 20th century, even prior to that, and most of it was lost because we've been involved in the black farmers struggle for many years, and that was the root of that struggle. That a lot of these farms, have been destroyed, just like people's homes here in the city of Detroit have been destroyed through the racism of the Department of Agriculture, their lending practices, and the mechanization of agriculture, which drove these African American farmers off their land. Okay, this brother here, and then we'll go to Wolf and Leon. Yes,
my question is in the spirit of her comments. Just being a devil's advocate, when they say that a fool and his money soon part. So if the black community is given reparations, then what? Because if we're given this money, and money that money parts, are white people absolved of? I mean,
no, they shouldn't be.
From a workers' world point of view, first question: what should be done with that money? And then
should be used to continue the struggle.
Okay.
Yeah, right. This would be a transitional.
If you were in charge of, if you were the emergency manager,
I wouldn't take the job.
Well, what would workers' world do?
Well, we advocate the moratorium on debt service and the eventual cancellation of debt service. A lot of these loans are totally illegitimate, that the city of Detroit has been ensnarled by. And just like in a lot of developing countries where they've had demands for the cancellation of the debt, we raise that same demand here in the city of Detroit because most of these loans are not legitimate loans. And that's what's straining the city. They're claiming that we owe over $16 billion.
$16 billion.
There's no way in the world we can pay that off. They can lay off everybody in the city of Detroit. They can re-enslave us. And then we still won't be able to pay it off. So they need to cancel the debt. The whole idea of what's going on right now is to bust the unions, to further disempower the African American population here in the city of Detroit. That is at the root cause of this whole crisis. They have no intentions of rebuilding Detroit. If they do rebuild it, it's going to be on their own terms. They want to drive even more people out. They want to bust the unions. They want to outsource all the public work, where a lot of African Americans work in the city. They work in the public school system. What did emergency managership do for the Detroit public schools? It drove it further into debt, drove more students out of the system. They have closed more schools. It's no solution. It's absolutely no solution. The conservatives When they come in and take over, things will never get worse. Just look at the wars. They went into Iraq. Iraq is chaos now. They went into Libya. Libya is totally destroyed. Libya had the most advanced living standard of any other country in Africa.
Right.
$165 billion in foreign assets. We had the highest income, highest standard of living, even of some countries in Western and Southern Europe. And you look at it today, they've bombed the infrastructure. The people who work in the oil industry today in Libya are going on strike because they don't know where the money is going. All the oil that's being sold in Libya, the money is being stolen. It's not going to the Libyan workers. You see, they created a refugee crisis, which sparked the war in Mali. Now they have a rationale for going in and bombing and occupying Mali. Niger, the same thing. Now the U.S. sent 100 troops to Niger, which is right next door to Mali. They announced it yesterday. Sending in drone stations and all of this. So it's the ruling class has no solution. Our solution is that the debt be canceled, and it's a transitional demand. It doesn't mean revolution. It doesn't mean state power for the workers, but it is a demand that is reasonable, that most working people can relate to if we explain it to them. For example, a moratorium on foreclosures. People know they can't pay off these mortgages. Most people say, yeah, we support a moratorium. You see, because they realize it's the most rational response in the short term. In the long term, our demands flow out of the notion that housing is a right, job is a right, healthcare is a right, education is a right. All those rights that you hear the conservatives say are not enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. You don't have a right to education. You don't have a right to a house. You don't have a right to a job. But we say there are rights that go beyond that. That if you're a human being and you live in society, you have a right to a home, you have a right to health care, you have a right to education, you have a right to peace and security. Wolf and then Leo. And then Ray.
You kind of stated what I was talking about Nigeria with the history. But history repeats itself because
what did Mark say? Bronx is twice as tall as
same thing going on today like in Mali and Syria. You got France, England, the United States now. And the same thing is going on there. You had France and England, which is Wall Street people, was wanted to go and get with the South, but you had Russia to come in and behalf of the North. A lot of people don't know that. The Russians came to our rescue back then. I'm talking about the North, And the same thing going on today because you got France and England, like you said, they want this war with Syria, the United States, Syria. This war with Mali, it's no different. The people in power, the bankers is one, they're running these wars. The bankers was running the South back then. They got their own from the bank, Wall Street. And it's almost like what happened, later on when they went after, what's the name, family? What was the guy that used to be on Russia? Czar, yeah. Because Czar had tried to help out North back then. Because once Russia got there, France and England could do that. They had, naval blockades and everything else. So the same thing repeats itself. And if it comes to a third war, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah, if it hasn't already started. Yeah. Okay, Leona and then Ray.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. I thought it was very good.
You're welcome.
And I know it's getting late. But what I want to ask you is, in your research for your presentation, did you come to, in any way, think about Theodore W. Allen's thesis? I'll read you his thesis right quick. And I'm wondering if it applies to the research you did. He says that, first of all, Theodore W. Allen's pioneering historical research, Class Struggle and the Origin of Racial Slavery, the Invention of the White Race, was first published as a Hoboken Education Project pamphlet in 1975. Its bold and innovative main thesis is the quote-unquote white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor unrest manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion, 1676 to 1677. Opened the floodgates
for an outpouring of subsequent studies on the white race?
Yeah, I think racism, is a key element in the division of the working class in this country and also the division of the oppressed. There's no question about it. The whites, landowners, even in the South, during slavery, they despised the poor whites who were non-landowners as well. But they used them, as a foot soldiers and cannon fodder, against the African American population. But they were actually manipulating and controlling, everything. And the whites, many of them didn't have land. They were poor. But they tried to convince them that they were better than our ancestors. And that was a serious problem. There were efforts, even during the latter part of the 19th century, through things like the Populist Party and other efforts to try to mobilize and organize all farmers and all people in the South, but it kept coming back to the national question. It kept coming back to that. And it's been a serious problem, for decades, well over a century. Even in the left movement in this country. You see some of the organizations on the left, they've been destroyed, because of their inability to effectively deal with the national question. And it's still a serious problem even up until this day. You have people who, for whatever reason, believe that America stands aside from the historical processes that take place in other parts of the world. And as a result of that, it's very difficult for them to deal, with imperialist war, to deal with national oppression, to put it actually at the forefront, of the general class struggle. And that's very, very important. Yeah, and then we can come back to
I just wanted to add,
Okay.
maybe you already mentioned this, but today is the 148th birthday of Dr. W.
Yes, I did mention it at the beginning. Thank you. Yeah, 145th. Yeah, great.
I just want to make a quick couple comments on your questions about the emergency manager. The emergency financial manager, in the first place, is there to ensure debt payments to the service, pay on the service to the banks, as a person, say if a worker somehow theoretically or hypothetically rather, a workers' world member was to be the emergency financial manager, if we found ourselves in that position, we would immediately, destroy the position where it stands and demand, like he said, that all services to the banks be stopped, all payments to the debt service. When it comes to reparations, reparations alone do not absolve white people of what they did to any person of color throughout history. None of it does. And if, for instance, the money was given to people of color, especially blacks, the reparation money, it would go towards struggle because the position of blacks and other people of color won't change in capitalism. The social relations in capitalism profit off of slavery, of wage slavery, and the inferior economic subordination and subjugation of people of color. Essentially, the fight doesn't stop until everyone is equal, and people will not be truly equal unless everyone's material needs are met. And hundreds of years, slavery, like chattel slavery, was a great way of extracting wealth off the backs of black people, and the only reason why that stopped is because the mode of production of the North, the way that the industrialists was a better way of getting profits. It was the more effective way. So that's really the only reason why slavery stops, because it was really more effective for the North to continue industrializing.
I think this brother here had a question.
Yeah, actually, it's more a comment than a question. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm glad I made it here. I can see why now that over the years I've read your articles and why I enjoyed them so much from hearing you actually speak. Also, to say I got a long way to go, man, to read a whole lot more, to study a whole lot more, because a lot of stuff you said that just I grasped it and I said, wow, that got me doing my study. Because I like history and I read a lot about history. a lot of the stuff you were saying that I didn't even hear about. I got to go back to the books and check those.
Well, thank you so much for those encouraging words. And my talk was very long, but there was so much material. I could have gone on a lot more because, like, what one of the comments was that it's a very complex period in history, and there's a lot more that could have been discussed. But maybe in later forms we can get to it. David.
So Ray was addressing the emergency manager, which you raised in a question. But remember, the emergency manager comes out of a law, and the law specifies the creation of the manager, and the only thing the manager cannot change by law is the payments to the debts to the bank. That must be paid. You can sell bailout, you can cancel contracts with vendors, you can change union contracts, which they're all doing. But that's why it's not really the question. The question is the struggle against not just the law, but the people who made those laws and how they control the government. On the question of reparations, don't have to necessarily talk about, I appreciate what you said, you give somebody some money and they blow it. Some people blow it. But reparations doesn't have to be a cash payment. Native Americans, I believe, certain Native Americans have free college education guaranteed. No? Well, then they should.
They should.
They should. And that's, okay, so you could guarantee oppressed people's free college education. For instance, the way schools in Michigan are funded, Detroit students per capita get one of the least. Gee, reparations could say that people in oppressed communities should get extra money for the schools. We would have the best schools, the highest level of computer literacy. There are a lot of these things that could be enacted from a legal point of view, quote unquote, that don't necessarily just put money in somebody's hands and say we're free, we're done with you, but structurally change the way things exist.
Leroy.
Is your presentation going to be online?
Yeah, hopefully I'll have it up later this evening after I do some editing. Yes. Mike, and then
This is idea of free education. Native Americans were guaranteed free education in all land-grant colleges, for example, in the state of Michigan. U of M's a land-grant college, Michigan State, I believe, is a land-grant college. But here's the kicker. You have to prove you're Native American. Until about 1953, in this country, you were either white or black. Native American would be listed as white. I was actually a student at the time, and this Native American guy goes to tell them Native American. Or they said, let's see your birth certificate. It's white. So they gave you the right, but they don't give you the right. This is America. This is how they do it. So now people have their true race or ethnicity put on the birth certificate. It's not always accurate. But it was like 1953 that they finally, 54, somewhere around there. I know that because my mother is not white. She's listed as white on my birth certificate. I'm the oldest child, and my brothers and sisters have a true race. The law changed for my sisters, before my sisters. So that's how they nailed the Native Americans.
So race is very political in the United States. Debbie?